Hi folks, this is Jack Spirko. Welcome to 6 Core Permaculture Techniques, producing food sustainably and naturally. I want to start out with a basic overview of permaculture, and this is going to be really quick, just so you have a frame of reference as we go through permaculture. The best way I've come up with to define permaculture is it's a system of design that's driven by a prime directive in three ethics, and that draws from the methodology of natural systems to create solutions for self-replicating, evolving, and infinitely sustainable systems, so that these systems not only continue to exist, but they actually replicate themselves and evolve and become infinitely sustainable, even if we're not around to take care of them on a daily basis. And this is driven by a prime directive in three ethics. The prime directive of permaculture is the only ethical decision is to take responsibility for ourselves and that of our children. So it's a very action-focused discipline that we are responsible for ourselves, and our children are our own responsibilities. And that maybe we're doing some things in some ways that aren't exactly looking out for the next generation, and we should back up a little bit. And we should do a better job of taking care of ourselves and future generations as well. And we do that through three ethics. The primary ethic being care of the earth. And it's simple. It's the only one we have. Every bit of wealth in the world actually comes from the earth. Every bit of ability to sustain life and feed ourselves comes from the earth. So we have to care for it. I think most people get through that one pretty simple. The next one is care of people. So there are some environmental policies that are remarkably harmful to individuals, that are harmful to people, and that's not permaculture either. If we're not balancing that equation, if we're not taking care of both the earth and people, we're not doing a good job. And the next one, the final one, is return of surplus. Now, there's some people in the permaculture world that they lean a little bit to the, let's call it the socialist side of things. Usually these are some of the younger members of the community, what have you, and driven by a revisionist version of the original ethics. They've changed this to redistribute the surplus or share the surplus or a fair share. It's really a poor way to look at it, because what I want you to understand is things like garbage and waste and manure and silage and all of the stuff that we get rid of on a daily basis in landfills, and that's surplus too. Surplus isn't just, food and money. Surplus is everything that a system produces, and an infinitely sustainable system will have the ability and be designed based on that surplus actually being returned, and only when it's producing such abundance that the surplus now can be used to replicate itself does it get redistributed. Otherwise, we take many things that could be solutions and turn them into problems, and that's not permaculture. And I want to just say that while I'm going to discuss the agricultural applications today, permaculture can be applied to any system, economics, energy, business, etc. And I want to ask you a favor. I want you to keep an open mind today. You're going to see some things, and I'm going to say some things you're going to think, that can't be right, that doesn't work, I know better, I've tried to grow in a garden all my life, things like that. I want to start out with a quote by my father. He used to tell me, son, never listen to anyone, never let anyone tell you about anything unless they're doing it doing better at it than you are. But please remember, if you agree with everything you hear, you're not learning a damn thing. So I want to start out with, this was a property that I managed for a while. We lived on part-time in Arkansas. And this is an area where we were playing around with some rocks and doing some things we eventually changed. But I want you to look at the landscape. This was rock. This was rock silica. It had a little bit of grass growing on it, but you couldn't. I tried to put a bird feeder in the ground here, one of the big stakes, and I couldn't get it in the ground. That's how bad this was. And the soil on top was white. And anybody that knows, when you look at land, white is not what you're looking for in soil. It wasn't sand. It was that depleted. When this property was put in, it was just basically scraped and pushed and made so that a house could be put in and so utilities could be put in, with no care for the land whatsoever. And we're sitting on top of a granite outcropping up here near the top of one of the mountains in the Ouachita Range in Arkansas. This is as tough as it gets, really. This is the same piece of property after about 9 months of management with permaculture. I'll go into more on how this stuff gets done, but what's been done here is 2 small hand-dug swales, which we'll talk about a great deal more in a bit, were put in, and a seed mixture was started in the spring, actually the summer of the preceding year. There was some summer cover crops that died off and then were replaced with fall cover crops, and basically the only thing that was done here, And the video, this is from a video, so it's a little bit hard to see some of what's going on, but just the lushness. And if you look in the background where I hadn't got to working yet, you can see what everything else looks like. It doesn't look very good. Again, this was a place, if you told somebody that it would look like this, they would have thought you were crazy. So here's two of the plants that made up this polyculture seed mix I put together. The yellow flowered stuff is mustard, and the white is a daikon radish. Those were designed to help penetrate that hard, rocky soil. Here's another picture. And now you can see, you don't only see a lot of daikon here, but if you look at the front, you'll see a stalk of wheat. Now, if you told somebody wheat would grow in this place 9 months before this picture was taken, they would have thought you're crazy. Look at that. In the back, you'll see some more mustard. You don't see the daikon here, but look over to the lower right-hand side, and you'll see some yellow or white and black flowers and some ovate leaves. That's fava bean, and below there, you'll see vetch. So this was really pretty amazing, and when people came out and saw this, they were kind of blown away by the number of insects and pollinators. This place just hummed and buzzed with pollinators. It was the only place like it for miles around on our mountain. This was one of the things that a lot of the neighbors thought we were kind of crazy when we started doing some things a bit differently. But when they saw this, they're like, how did you do that? How is it possible? And it's really just simple techniques that we're going to go through today. This is also, I want to show you, sometimes it doesn't take 9 months. Sometimes it can be quicker. This is from the property I'm on right now. This is an area behind my garden. This is what the ground looks like there. I talked to the neighbor who's lived here since 1970. I told him I was going to put some seed down here. He said nothing would ever grow. It's not possible. He's been here since 1970, and there's never been anything along that fence line except a few weeds here and there. Well, how about this? This is the property on April 24th, 2013, 52 days later. This is the exact same strip of land that I took that picture of the ground from. Let me show you this. I backed up to, and if you look at the foreground, you can see where I started working on the property and where I hadn't yet. So that's what it looks like directly in front of you. That's what that whole strip looked like. That took 52 days. So just please keep an open mind that some of these things actually can work. And even if they're counter to what you've been taught to believe or what your experience tells you, that they can change. I want you to look at this next slide for me. And I want you to think about this. Who tills and fertilizes the forest and the prairie, let alone the deserts? Up in the top left-hand corner, you'll see Big Bend National Park in Texas in August. That's desert country, folks. That's not far from El Paso. It's a hell of a lot closer to El Paso than it is to Dallas, Texas. It's along the Mexican border. Now, there's a reason that's so green and lush. You see all that rock? Well, water streams off that rock, and rock creates 100% runoff. Now, we can actually design a system, not one I'm going to talk about in depth today, but from that part of nature right there, we could design a system in a relatively arid climate, or even one that gets a lot of rain. We could pile up a bunch of rocks in the center. We could build up an earth wall in a circle around those rocks and plant into that area. Whenever we do get rainfall, we'll get 100% runoff from the rocks. We'll also get some condensation effect from the rock. The water will seep into the earth around it, and the earth wall that we build around the structure will actually help harvest and hold the water. And if we mulch and polyculture that, which means plant lots of different plants in there, we can get a very sustainable system. That's been done all around the world. It's an ancient technique, and it's been done with huge formations like this one. This one's a bit steep for it, but there are many formations like this out there that have been naturally turned into those systems, and there's been systems fabricated that way, just by using a combination of hard runoff and water retention. That's why that's working there. But I also want you to look, Nigeria and the Sahel region, over in the top right corner. This is out of Permaculture magazine. This was terraced. That's pretty much all that was done. The Sahel region, for those who don't know, is in sub-Saharan Africa. This is the place that when you see kids starving on TV, this is where they're at. Look at the abundance there. Now, they're not irrigating this. They don't have the resources to do that. And look at what's happened simply by going in and changing the shape of the land. Just over on the bottom left-hand corner, that's a road leading up to the home that I started out this showing you some pictures of. That's Arkansas in July. It hadn't rained in 45 days. Look how green the trees are. And then down in the bottom right, you see Llano, Texas in May. My only point here is that these natural systems with little to no help, and in 3 of the 4, no help at all by mankind, are lush. And they're productive in very different landscapes. Texas prairie, Arkansas granite mountaintop, and West Texas desert, all green, all lush, because the system of nature actually knows what it's doing. That's what everything I'm going to talk to you about is based on today. Now, there's 2 primary aspects to permaculture. One is design science, how the system functions and mimics nature. And that's driven by principles of design. So that's like the academic side of things. And then there's the techniques. These are the methods compiled within the design, which are the assemblage of new and ancient techniques. In this presentation, I'm going to focus on techniques because, well, they're more interesting in an academic session than they are, than going into the design science for 2 hours or more. I want you to take action on some level after hearing me today, so I'm going to give you things you can do. And I know that's what you came to get. I know that's what you want from this presentation, what I can do. I'm going to cover some design science and principles, though, because, well, they provide me the only means of self-sufficiency. Or they provide you with the only means of self-sufficiency. If you're going to be self-sufficient, you're going to have to understand the design science so that you can do things on your own, because your property won't be exactly like any property I'm going to show you today. So you're going to have to make some independent decisions. The science and the principles are the only thing that provides a means of advancement. So you might come up with your own ideas. And I'm going to tell you, there's 2 questions I get about permaculture all the time. What if? The answer to that is, it probably doesn't matter. The next question is, can I? And the answer to that is almost always yes. Doesn't mean you should, but what if and can I get in the way a lot? Can I should actually drive you forward if you understand the design and the principles. And every technique that I'm going to show you, and every technique that exists in permaculture, is driven by the science and the principles, and because I can blend them into the techniques and trick you into learning them, so that's what I'm going to do. The 6 techniques I'm going to cover today are forest gardening and food forest establishment, which are kind of the same but a little bit different, and I'll explain that as I go through it. I'm going to talk about creating and using seed mixtures. I'm going to talk about converting lawns into pastures. I'm going to talk about zone planning and implementation, and if you don't know what that means, it'll make sense when I get to it. I'm going to talk about mob grazing and how that can be adapted to small livestock paddock shift systems. I'm going to talk about developing your own regionally adapted seed strains. I'm going to talk about my technique that I've invented and pioneered myself this year that's still in testing phases, contour-based wood core beds. And I'm going to talk a little bit at the end about how we can tie these systems together. And what I'm hoping is, I'm going to show you some pictures at the end of today's presentation that you'll see with new eyes, that you'll see differently than you would have before sitting through it. If I get that, then I've had success with what I'm doing today. So as we go into the first one, which is forest gardening and creating food forests, I chose to lead off with this, 1, because it's the most complex, and 2, because it's going to become an anchor for everything else we're going to do. And while it'll take a long time to get through forest gardening, it'll let me move much faster through a lot of the rest of things, because we'll understand a lot of words and we'll develop a lot of vocabulary as we look at this. And because in reality, if you want to know what the most sustainable thing in the world is, it's forest. The forest is infinitely sustainable. It's self-replicating. That's exactly what we're trying to create. So it's where we go first to look for our teacher. The forest is the teacher. And there's probably 1,000 lessons from the forest. And I could probably do 2 weeks of lecture on just what the forest can teach us. But I've broken out a few lessons that I think are really important to start grasping why a lot of this stuff works. The first one here is the forest floor is a lake. If you take some soil out of a healthy, thriving forest and you put a little bit of water in it and then you put it on a slide and you put it underneath a microscope and you look at it, you'll almost think you're looking at pond life. You'll see all sorts of little organisms crawling around, moving around, floating. You'll see organisms that literally live in water, like a pond organism. One little droplet of water will spherically go around one tiny particle of soil, something so small you can't even see the particle of water, and there might be dozens of little life forms living in that little sphere. And what we learned from this is that, again, by looking at the forest floor as a lake, we understand that the forest floor holds a lot of water. Think about 1 million acres of forest. Now think about the fact that, let's say in 3 feet of forest soil, we could hold almost a foot of water. All right. If we took 3 feet of good, moist, just been rained on forest soil and squeezed it, we could almost get a foot of water out of 3 to 4 feet of forest soil. So what is 1 million acres 1 foot deep in water? That's a pretty sizable shallow lake. But if we see it in a different way, if we fold it in on itself, then we're actually looking at, let's say, 100,000 acres that's 10 feet of water. Is that not a massive lake? And that means that not only does the water exist in the forest floor, and it's not only accessible to the trees, it's not only why forest stands drought better than other systems, it also explains some other things that we're going to look at today, because if there's water in a landscape, trust me, it's moving. It's got currents, it's got flows. It always goes down. It never goes up unless a tree or something spongy sucks it up. Its main movement is down. We call it right angle to contour. Fancy way to say water always moves downhill. It's moving through the landscape. Consider that as we continue through this. Lesson 2, nature never monocrops, so neither should we. On the left side of your screen, you got a big cornfield. Looks kind of cool, got an interesting pattern, but really it's kind of boring. And if you are a pest and you like corn, you're like, let's go. The other picture's from the land that I used to own in Arkansas. I went through that area, and I was able to not identify all by name, but I was able to identify over 40 different plants just in that one seemingly barren area. Nature never monocrops. Plants form symbiotic relationships. We'll talk more about that in a bit. But if nature never monocrops and the forest never monocrops, and the forest is sustainable and we want to be sustainable, that means we shouldn't monocrop either, which means we shouldn't go in and plant large stands of just one single species for a variety of reasons. Next up, slow water creates more life. If you look at these two images, and I said, I got a gun to your head, you're going to drink water without purifying it from one of these two places. It's a wilderness survival tactic. You gotta pick a place to drink water. Do you want to drink it from the slow, stagnant frog pond or the fast-moving stream? And I know the answer technically is really neither, because we could have contaminants in either one, but the likelihood of you getting sick is higher from the frog pond because it's full of life. Some of that life might be Calyptosporidium and Gerardia, and we don't want that when we're putting it into our bodies. But when we're putting water into a landscape, we want to slow the water down. We want to make it take, in most instances, not all, but most instances, the longest, slowest path off the property. That's what the forest does. The next thing that we learn from the forest is the fungus are the teeth of the forest. What I mean by that is you'll seldom find rotted wood in a forest without finding fungus on it. You could see it right there if you look to the right side of the log. There's some white fungus growing there, and it's literally eating the carbon in the trees and returning it to the soil of the forest. So we have this huge fear of fungi in modern agriculture. Fungal infections, there's powdery mildew, and all these different things that get on plants. But the reality is if we sterilize fungus, we remove the health of the soil and the ability of the soil to build itself. Now, we don't just want to be dumping compost in a place all the time. If we want it to be infinitely sustainable, it needs to perform its own breakdown of material. And to do that, we need fungus. So that's the next lesson we learn. The next lesson after that is a forest grows on a fallen forest. This will lead us to certain techniques. But what I want you to look at here's an old stump. I don't know how old it is, but you can see that there's several small new seedling trees literally growing right up out of the existing stump. That means that as the fungi break down the carbon and moisture builds up in these trees, they actually become nests and beds for new trees to develop. And the glades that are created, and a glade is an opening in a forest. When a tree falls, that tree itself provides some of the food and fuel and humic matter necessary to propagate the next species. Lesson 5 on the forest growing on a fallen forest. I want to talk about this as a technique. Here you'll see from Jeff Lawton a diagram of how this can work when we plant a designed forest. And you'll notice there's pioneer trees and sacrificial trees. And that means that some of the trees that we might plant in a large food forest design won't be there in 10 years. Some won't be there in 5 years. And you see the legumes, and you see it's like shattered. And that's because that's a very fast-growing tree that produces nitrogen in the soil. So once it grows up to a certain height, we cut it and we throw it to the ground. And it grows back, and we cut it and we throw it to the ground again. And it grows back, and we cut it and we throw it to the ground again. Sooner or later, some of them will just give up. But what we've done now is we've accelerated a natural process of the forest falling, and we've not taken out any of the beneficial trees, or I should say the end trees, the trees we want at the end. We've actually used these other trees to support them. When we're doing that, that means we can plant a lot more trees in the beginning than will be there in the end. This is called stacking in time. Okay, and we're stacking in space and time here. It sounds real complicated, but it's really not. All we're saying is, if I'm going to have a place with 10 trees at the end of it, I can have 100 trees at the beginning. I just need to know which trees are going to be sacrificed for the good of the final 10. That's how we develop a food forest. Lesson 6, there's 7 primary layers in a forest. This is a place where I've gotten into some conversations with conventional growers, conventional gardeners that say, but this is why I don't like permaculture, because you're telling me I'd have 7 layers. What if I don't want 7 layers? The layers are not something you design. The layers are something that exists. The layers are space. And this actually gives us a completely different lesson if we look at it right. Why do you always pull that weed out of that one place and you pull it out by the roots and you completely get rid of it, and then you come back 2 or 3 or 4 weeks later and there's another weed there, either the same kind or a new one, and you yank it out and you come back and it's there again, and you yank it out and you come back and it's there again, and you yank it out and you come back and it's there again. You haven't put anything in its place. That's why. That's why it keeps coming back. It's trying to repair the land. That's part of it. Any weed you see can actually tell you a lot about the land. When you see a weed with a deep penetrating taproot, that means the soil is compacted. When you see a weed with really loose, hairy, shallow roots, that means the soil is loose and friable and weak and it's trying to hold it together. So if we want to get rid of what we're calling a weed, and I actually think weeds are wonderful in many, not all, but many instances, but if we want to get rid of a certain weed, then when we remove it, we need to replace it. That's how forest works. It doesn't matter if you don't want 7 layers. The layers exist in space. You either fill them or nature will, and son of a gun, she'll fill them with something you'll probably call a weed. So the layers are the canopy. That's the large overstory trees. Your lower tree level, this is a tree level that comes in, and usually you see this mostly at the edge of a forest. It's part of how the forest advances into savanna and moves out forward. Okay, so you have your high trees, your low trees. You have a shrub layer. These are all your woody shrubs. These you really see on the forest. You don't see a lot of shrubs deep into the forest. Then you have your herbaceous layer. These are things like comfrey, beets, herbs. These are all your plants that are not shrubs. Then they can be perennials or annuals, and usually in a natural system, self-reseeding annuals. And then you have your rhizosphere, or your roots. Okay, so this, again, beets is a good example. Beets have a root yield, and they have an herbaceous layer, so plants can occupy more than one space. But that root layer is critically important, that we have something in there to make that up. And if you think about it, all of the trees, all of the bushes, all the shrubs have something going on in the root layer, but things like sweet potato have a root yield, so it's also part of a yield that we're looking at as well here. 6 is the soil surface, or the ground layer. These are things that would crawl around the ground, like strawberries, are a great crowning and trailing perennial fruit that most people enjoy eating. I call strawberries the pepperoni of the fruit and vegetable world, because almost every kid eats pepperoni on a pizza, and almost every kid will eat strawberries. But sweet potato could also be a ground cover and a root yield. The thing is, we got to put something in all these places, again, or natural, and then the vertical layer, climbers and vines. Perennially, we could use things like kiwi and grapes. And annually, we can use things like climbing beans and other things like that. We'll talk about that in just a second. So there's a couple different ways we can really establish a food forest. One way that's being done a lot by Jeff Lawton and his people is with chickens. And you can see kind of, this is a time-lapse photo of a forest just being advanced with a device called a chicken tractor. So if you look where the chickens are on the far left, they're on a new piece of land. And they're basically kept there until they take the land down to bare soil. We then go in and we plant a guild, which is a grouping of trees, bushes, shrubs, vines, root plants, ground cover, and we also probably are going to plant something very healing to the land that will nitrify the soil, in addition to the chicken manure, like a cow pea or a vetch or something like that. And you can see over time it progresses and moves up, and we can just advance a strip of forest, or even, a couple hundred meters of forest at a time, using chickens in a system like this. Here's another way to do it on a bigger level. Instead of a small chicken tractor, in this instance, you see Jeff Lawton here, he's doing this that's a mobile chicken coop. There's about 50 birds. There's about 100 square yards of electronet fence, and those birds will be in there for weeks, and they'll keep adding mulch, and the birds will keep churning the mulch into the soil, and they're converting basically old cow pasture into food forest and advancing it forward as they go. That's one way to do it, and it helps us with taking out a lot of the manual labor. The chickens get to eat natural stuff. They get to move through the system. We'll talk about moving them through permanent paddocks in a bit later. But in this case, what they're doing is they're establishing a forest. Now, the interesting thing is these chickens will never see this as a forest. Chickens don't live that long. But their children, or maybe their grandchildren, will end up foraging through the very forest that they helped establish. And you can see that when their work is done, they'll be able to forage through a forest that was established by their ancestors directly behind the netting. That's an existing food forest. So the food forest can actually support us and our livestock. And that's a great symbiotic relationship as well. And that way the chickens or other livestock continue to provide nutrient for the forest. Next up, the other way this is done, and a lot of times it's done in combination, but is with a swale. I can only go so deep into swales today, but this is an example of a food forest system built on a swale. The key to understanding a swale is to understand that swales do not move water. They stop it. They slow it. They really slow it down. There's really no such thing as water that's completely at rest. It's either evaporating or seeping through or being pulled somewhere. Gravity's acting on it. Wind's acting on it. Solar radiation's acting on it. But a swale is the closest thing we can get to stopping it in a natural system. And what I want you to look at here is how this forest is planted. We've got asparagus on the dry side of the swale because we're still going to get some seepage back. We've got comfrey for nutrient. We've got blueberries and gooseberries and sweet potato. We've got fruit trees. We've got leguminous trees, which are trees that actually provide nitrogen to the soil. You can see it's quite a polyculture. It mimics nature, but it's a designed mimic of nature. We have things that we have chosen to put into this system over time to establish these forests for us. And I want you to really understand swales because a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is going to, from this point forward, assume that you understand putting something in on contour. So if you look, here's a really hilly location. Now, you tell somebody to find the level lines in a place like this, and they generally say to you, you know, it's not level, it's steep. But if you look at the lines, you'll see that there's always contours. There's always a point that's level with another point, that's level with another point, and it either continues on almost infinitely, dead ends into some kind of a shifted system, or returns back onto itself. Usually contours eventually kind of turn back onto themselves. This is an exaggerated version of that. But if I wanted to put a swale on the hill in the back hill, I could take any one of those lines and put in a ditch, a level ditch. And when I do that, when water comes down grade and hits that ditch, it's not going to flow left or right. It's going to stop, and it's going to fill up level. And eventually, if it fills up enough, it can overflow. I'm going to go back real quick. What I want you to understand, though, is if we look at this diagram, you can see the swale's been excavated, the earth has been removed, and a hill has been built on the downhill side. This is very important. That ditch is not compacted, it's loose. And that hill is not compacted, it's loose. Water, when it fills that ditch, if it stops raining, will seep into the ground straight down and begin to go downgrade and will wick up into the mound. The next thing is that hill is not what keeps the water in the swale. Somewhere there's an overflow, a spillway. We call it a sill. And if you look at the level line in that swale right there, somewhere there is a place where when that water goes a little bit higher, it will begin to actually sheet out over top of the rest of the swale. Let me back up there again. I want to cover that again, just a little bit more on this. That sill will be about a meter to 2 meters long, and the earth there on the downgrade side will be compacted, dead level, but about 2 inches lower than the lip of the rest of the swale. So it would be like having a great big tank and cutting one, and on one end of it, cutting about 2 inches off the lip of it, and doing that for a few feet, and then putting a garden hose in that tank. Eventually, that tank will get to a point where the water will sheet over that place you've done the cutout. And unless you have a really big hose with a lot of water, the tank will never overflow anywhere else. But even if it does, it will do so very passively. So even if there's not enough sill, if there's not enough overflow, that the water starts to get up to that mound, it will distribute itself equally as it passes through, and it's not likely to erode a swale. So I want you to look here now with an understanding of how we can combine these techniques, food forest establishment with swales and chickens. So over on the left, you'll see an old food forest. That's been there for 10 years. It's well established. And I want you to look. It's kind of a strip. It follows a swale. It's nice. It's beautiful. But when we say forest, sometimes people think of like 100 acres. We can do that. But in this case, that's not what we've done. We've left a place between the swales for cattle to graze. We've got a new swale, and we've got new forest being created in this strip right here. Now, we also have another swale here with new forest. And then if we come down, you see where the chicken tractor is. That's right where the picture I showed you with Jeff with the chickens were. And what we've got is we've got a vegetable garden here. We've got food forest being advanced this way. Actually being advanced back toward the vegetable garden is how that's being done. So they started here. This is the newest forest put in where it says new food forest emerging. The chickens have stripped the ground where the tractor is now, and they're heading, and they'll forest it all the way back to the vegetable garden over where it says student camping back there. And we have other forests being put in and other types of plants being grown. If we look down to the bottom right, you'll see swaling's been done there. The main type of forest that's being put in there, though, is a bamboo forest for a different type of yield, building material. Bamboo is a great building material. This is a permaculture institute in Australia that Jeff manages. This is one example of how these two techniques are put together. I also want to, though, when you see all this big stuff, there's a problem with permaculture. People look at it and they see somebody design a 100-acre farm, like I just showed you, and they go, well, it's for big property. It won't work in my backyard. Or a forest is too big to put in a backyard. We can definitely do it. Let's look at putting together what we'll call a guild, which is a symbiotic system of plants. Let's follow the formula, and let's come up with something that we could put in a very small suburban backyard that will mimic forest and be very, very sustainable. We'll put in 1 or 2 semi-dwarf apple trees, or semi-dwarf pears, or semi-dwarf plums, or whatever. Normally, we would put in full-size trees for the canopy, but we're just going to step back and scale it down a bit to fit it into the landscape. So 1 or 2, these are your primary overstories. You could even do 3 or 4 of these and really not get that big. Then we're going to add 2 to 3 dwarf peaches or dwarf apples. And I'm talking true dwarfs, trees that will only grow up to about 5 feet high. Semi-dwarfs can grow 12, 14, but we can prune them and keep them around 8. And we can keep them from canopying out too much. We can shape them however we want. So we're going to plant those into a system together. Large trees and small trees closer together than the instructions tell you, okay? Kind of mimicking a forest. We're also going to then go in and put in several blackberry and blueberry plants. Those are going to be our shrubs. We'll put in 2 gumi bushes, which is a plant that's native to the Ukraine. It's a shrub. It's very, very prolific. It produces great little red, tasty fruits, and it fixes nitrogen. So now we're taking this fruit bush that's going to last the whole time the system's there, and we're letting it stand in for our nitrogen-fixing trees. Then we'll make a mix of herbs and flowers, even vegetables. We can do annuals in the system. It's small enough that we can manage that. We can leave a space to plant our annuals in that system and have them nursed by the perennials. But that's going to be our herbaceous layer primarily. Then maybe we'll come in and we want some more annuals that have a vining component because this is a small system. And if I go put in big, heavy-duty perennial vines in this system, they might overrun it. They might not be able to handle a couple grapevines. So each spring, maybe I plant beans and cucumbers, or maybe some sort of squash into the system, and let that take up the vining layer. And the beans, again, fix nitrogen. Well, it's more than that, because the beans are a vine. They're also a ground cover, and, you know, we can even have some ground covers that go into the rhizosphere, like you see below with sweet potatoes, and have that. Maybe we put strawberries in this. Then we put a little bit of horseradish, which is a great usable herb, and comfrey, which is a good nutrient miner. And that system has all of the layers. But yet we could build that system in an area, honest to God, you could build that in an area smaller than most people's living rooms today. Certainly in the size of a large living room, we could fit all of that and more, and we've mimicked the forest on a postage stamp lot in a backyard. And we can recreate that over and over again. This system can be installed in a small yard. We could even use a small swale and a garden pond. We could do this kind of over in the corner of a yard. We could put in a typical small garden pond, 300-400 gallons of water, some with a hard shell, but we could do it with a little swale. The swale could feed out into the system. It's small enough that even if the land isn't shaped the way we want to, we could literally change the shape of the land and make the swale any shape we want. We'll create our own contour to handle the overflow from that pond and to fill it initially when it rains and bring the nutrient out of the pond. Has all 7 layers. I would establish it when I first planted it, and I've disturbed all the soil along with a mix of buckwheat and cowpea if it were a summertime project to help prepare the soil. I might do something like, triticale, which is a sterile cross between wheat and rye, and Austrian winter pea if it was a fall installation. And it could be easily established with a chicken tractor if you wanted to do it. In fact, that would probably be the best way to do it. Instead of going out there and chopping at the soil with shovels or small excavators, just put chickens in it, clear it out and do it. Now, it's just places where you can't do it with chickens, but if you can, there you go. Now, here's the interesting thing. That system and changing some of the ingredients in the recipe could be done over and over and over. If you had a 1-acre property and you put in one of these systems twice a year, imagine how quickly it would populate, as much of the property as you wanted to use for it. I just want you to be able to see that we can scale this up and down. We could go even smaller. We could make our overstory a dwarf tree and do a tiny little guild with a few bushes and shrubs and something that just looks like a little garden, but all the layers are there. We are the designer. We are the artist. The earth is our canvas. The choices are up to us. I also want you to realize when done properly, these forests can last 2,000 years in a desert. This is Morocco. This is a 2,000-year-old food forest from Jeff Lawton's video on food forest establishment. And you can see that it looks quite lush. Let me back off it, though, a little bit. This is where it is. Look at this. I mean, it's rock. It's desert rock and sand. But yet here it stands. And you notice it's in a long, narrow band. Why? What's in there? A swale. This is date palm and pomegranates and citrus. But the people of this region of Morocco have been manually taking care of this. There's no irrigation here. There's nowhere to pump it from 2,000 years ago. This is a naturally established system that's last 2,000 years in the desert. That should give you an idea of what you can do with a food forest. Again, I'm just giving you a major overview today. These subjects each could go into hours and hours and hours on their own. But hopefully I've given you a foundation now. We can begin to go forward. And as we go forward, you can use the foundational knowledge that you have now to understand as I move a little bit faster through the other segment. So I'm going to move on from there, and I'm going to go into creating seed mixtures. And this is something that gets a lot of questions in the permaculture industry. Sepp Holzer's widely known for his magic seed mixtures, and I give him some credit for what he's done, but I think seed mixtures are a little bit overcomplicated by some, and I don't think really what you should be saying is what's X's, so-and-so's recipe for a seed mixture. A lot of times, especially people like Sepp that are over in Europe, they might have access to certain seeds and varieties that we can't even get here. And then we'll sit here and go, oh, I wish I could get that. And in some instances, I agree. But in reality, and when I get to seed saving later, I'm going to show you how the best seed for your property is probably produced on your property anyway. What we really need to be doing is going, well, what is my goal? So what I've come up with for seed mixtures is something that's a little bit different. Instead of telling you what to use, and I'm going to give you a list of things that I find useful for making seed mixtures, but it's pretty much going to be, well, everything. I think we should be asking ourselves questions and then letting that dictate to us what we're going to build as a seed mixture for our land. And for maybe not just for our property, but I might build a seed mixture as a cover crop to establish a garden bed that's going to be planted with perennials, and I might build a completely different seed mixture for a place I'm going to be ranging my chickens through on a regular basis. So this is how that works out. Number one, what is your end goal? That's the first thing I just talked about. What do you want this to do? Are you wanting to establish something that's there forever? Or is it just is it a time stacking thing? Is it just, hey, I want to hold the ground together and protect it until other things come up and take over? Is it a pioneering seed mixture that's starting this out? Or is it a long-term pasture? Or is it a long-term symbiotic ground cover that's going to work with other things? What are we trying to create? What's your climate type? I'm going to plant something totally different in South Florida than I'm going to plant in Illinois. Some of the same seeds might get used, but the overall thing is going to change. I got humid subtropics and I've got cool, temperate, Midwestern prairie. I mean, those are two different worlds. Can I irrigate? Is this going to be irrigated? If it's going to be irrigated, we can plant things that maybe wouldn't work in another situation. That means that our seed mixtures that are closer to our property, and we're going to talk about that in a bit, might be a little bit different than our seed mixtures that are out on what we might call the broad acre. And the broad acre is very different. For somebody that's got a 10-acre property, they might have places that's doing irrigation at full acre or more. For somebody with 3 acres of property, they might decide, hell, you know what? I'll spend the money in the infrastructure. I'll irrigate everything. And some people on that 3-acre property might only irrigate a quarter or a half of an acre, and they'll have to think about that when they're building different seed mixtures for different applications. What is my average rainfall? Whether I can irrigate or not, I want to know that. If I get 30 inches of annual rainfall, I'm going to build a seed mixture differently than if I only get 20. If I get 45, I might be able to put a few things in there. And I'm going to look at, additionally, these seeds, how do they utilize the rainfall? There's seeds that are perennial. They'll come back every year, but they pretty much go dormant in the summer, and it doesn't matter that I don't get a lot of rainfall in the summer. It just matters, do I get enough rainfall in the spring? I need to look at that in relation to what I'm building. What's the ground like? Is it that stony crap like I showed you at the beginning of this presentation? Is it already covered with something? Is it loam? What's the pH? What's the ground like? Can I till or disturb the soil? In other words, am I going to just throw it down, broadcast it, or am I going to do something, whether it's with chickens or with mechanical means like a plow? Will it be harrowed? Harrowed means to cover. So we plow the field, then we put the seed down. This is traditional agriculture, and then we harrow it, which means we basically knock the dirt back into the furrows from the plow. Well, there's other ways to harrow a seed mixture. We could not disturb the ground, not till it at all. If it's got enough exposure to the earth, we could then put down a seed mixture on top of it. We could harrow it with rotted straw or hay. We want to use hay or straw. It depends. If it's going to be a pasture and it's good hay, then any seed that happens to be left over in the hay, we don't really care about it. If we're doing something kind of unique and kind of specific, so designer type of seed mixture, and we don't want other seeds in there, we're going to use straw for that, because it's going to be free of most seed. So we have to look at that as well. But we don't always have to harrow it in the traditional agricultural sense for it to be covered. What livestock do I want to support, if any? Am I going to put animals through this or not? Ask that question. It starts to give you answers. Will I reseed annually, and if so, why? There's times you may want to. There's times you may never want to do it again. If you're going to want to reseed annually, we can use a lot more annuals in the mixture. I'll tell you why you might want to do that in a bit. If we're gonna not want to reseed, we may use annuals as a nurse crop, but we have to be careful. We use an aggressive annual that outcompetes all the perennial seeds that we put down. Like, let's say buckwheat. When that buckwheat dies off, if we've spread too thick, too much buckwheat in our ratio to our other seeds, there may not be any of those perennials left. They may have been completely choked out in a 6 to 8 week cycle it takes for buckwheat to do its thing. So we have to think about that as well. What season is it? I'm going to plant different seeds on different seasons. In the spring, I might plant buckwheat and cowpea to nurture a new bed. In the fall, I would probably plant something more like vetch and winter pea. So what season is it? What plants will winter or summer kill? Do I want that? So here's another thing. So I just said I would do something, but maybe I would do something differently. Let's say I was putting together a garden bed, and I'm heading into fall, okay? And I'm going to get some frost temperatures and things like that. I'm going to want to plant fall vegetables, things that can handle a little bit of frost, spinach and things like that, in with this mixture of seed. Well, I might plant cowpea and buckwheat. Why? If I get that first frost, it'll kill it dead. And when it kills it dead, the little plants that I've put in there and sown early that have gotten the shade and gotten the protection of the seed mixture now are opened up to the winter sun. And now they can take over. Well, if I didn't put something in that would winter kill, it would probably choke out my other plants that I'm trying to cultivate for my own use. Okay? If I want it to stay covered from the summer all the way through the winter, I may even go in and plant summer cowpea and buckwheat along with winter pea and vetch all at the same time, or even maybe cayuse oat all at the same time. The buckwheat and the cowpea will outcompete those other seeds. But eventually, as the winter time comes over, it'll flip, and I've only had to do one planting, and I let nature do the work, and in the spring, when it gets hot, we'll kill off these other plants for me, or at least disadvantage them, and now I can success it into something else. It all depends on what I want. How is the seed going to be spread? There's something interesting about spreading seed. People like the little seed spreaders you roll around and things like that. When you start making a mixture and all the seeds are different sizes, all of a sudden those things don't work real well anymore. But there's this magical seed spreader. It's really amazing that will spread seed of all different sizes evenly at the same time once you get a little practice with it. It's called your hand. So I'm actually a big fan of spreading seed by hand if I'm managing areas small enough to do it that way. How large is the area? I mean, the seed's expensive. The larger the area, the more I'm going to have to take economics into the situation. What's my budget? Is the ground compacted or loose? If you answer all those questions and you start looking at all different things that are available as far as seed goes and quantity, you'll figure out exactly what you want. Now, let's talk about why we would do this, because we talk about all this stuff about choosing seeds. Why do we usually do this? Well, number one, we use them as cover crops to protect beds and fields during non-cropping seasons. So if I put my garden bed to rest for the fall and winter and bring it back in the spring, I would want to plant it with a good quality cover crop. Again, cayuse oat and things like vetch, winter pea, things like that spring to mind because they can make it through the winter. At least they can grow, and in a really harsh environment, even if the frost kills them, there'll be this dead mat of organic matter preventing emergent winter weeds. And when I go to plant in the summer, I've got a mulch layer sitting there. Okay, to build organic matter and improve soil, one of my favorite mixes to do this is cowpea and buckwheat. The buckwheat produces a tremendous amount of organic matter, and the cowpea provides nitrogen to provide support for other main crop species. I'm about to do one of my beds is a little mini forest guild, almost like the one I described, many of the same plantings. But that bed, instead of covering it with a thick mulch right away, I'm going to plant the hell out of it with buckwheat, cowpea, and maybe millet. And I'm going to plant the perennials right into that mix. They'll act as a nurse crop. And eventually, since all the other ones are annuals, they'll die off. That organic matter will go to the soil. Some of the yield may go to my chickens. And then we'll come in with a heavy mulch layer once that soil has been conditioned by that seed mix. That's another way we might use it to provide crops in and of themselves. If we do pasture, we can provide a crop for our chickens. If we do a seed mixture with grain, we can provide a yield for ourselves or for our livestock. To attract and encourage pollinators and other beneficial insects. The stuff that I showed you with the mustard and the fava bean and all of that at the beginning, again, that place hummed with pollinators and beneficials. That's what my garden did so well. It was right next to it. To fix nitrogen. Legumes fix nitrogen through a symbiotic relationship with bacteria in the soil. It's better to grow your own nitrogen than to dump it on the ground. To act as feed crops for livestock. To prevent and reduce erosion. And that's really the big thing that I did. That place I showed you with the stony ground that I did in 42 days. Really what that did was I went in there and threw some sandy soil mix from the old gardens that the people here had down. I put down a decent seed mixture. It started. It really can't get a hold yet. I got a lot of work to do there yet. But it got enough of a hold to stop the erosion and let the natives that were trying so hard, the native weeds and then wildflowers that make the rest of the property actually beautiful, were trying so hard to pioneer that place. And they just couldn't get it done. I gave them just a little bit of advantage. It kicked them over the edge. And you know, my neighbor looks at it and goes, I don't understand. Well, hopefully you guys understand from watching this how simple that really is. Another thing is to prepare the ground. We can till with roots. If we have compacted clay soil and we put daikon radish and mustard in there, those roots will go deep and drive down into that tough soil. And when we either cut them or let them die off, those roots will rot and that soil's now opened up. And we've basically tilled, but we've tilled the way nature does using a plant. To restore balance to areas that have been monocropped. If a place has just been corn, beans, corn, beans, corn, beans, it's out of balance. We've got to do something to bring it back into balance. A good thought out seed mixture is a way to do that. Or to convert your lawn into a low maintenance pasture. I hate lawns. They require mowing. Pastures are things I can feed animals with. They grow lower than lawns. They look beautiful. They have wildflowers in them. They have these things people call weeds. I love them. And they're so much easier to maintain. They don't require a lot of effort. They require a goat or a chicken or a goose to take care of them for me. And they can produce a lot of things I can use medicinally and for salads. They might have things in them like plantain or plantain, depending on how you pronounce it. To me, a plantain looks like a green banana. A plantain is an herb that's in the ground. Things like that grow right into your lawn. I have growing on my property spiderwort, which is this beautiful purple flower. Looks like something you would plant. It's growing everywhere. It's also a pot herb. It can be used medicinally. This is what I want in my yard, not Bermuda grass, not, Raleigh St. Augustine. So that's another, way that these can be used. Some useful seeds for making mixtures. Here, these are some of my go-to favorites. Oats, cowpeas, buckwheat, daikon radish, mustards. And these are not generally the mustards that you get that you grow for greens. These are a bigger variety of mustard that are designed for using as cover crops. Clovers of all types. Again, I've got a legume here. I've got a nitrogen fixer. Annual ryegrass. It dies off, but it's really hardy. And if we let it go, it'll self-reseed a lot, and it can nurse the perennial grasses that are next. Plantain, chicory. Chicory is a great medicinal. It's a great plant for your livestock. Vetch, nitrogen fixer. It's an annual, but it often self-reseeds and comes back. Barley, wheat. Those are great crops we can use for yields for animals or for ourselves, and they can be grown sporadically. They don't have to be a field. Triticale, which is a cross between wheat and rye that's sterile. So if I want something like wheat or rye or barley, but I don't want it to reseed, I don't want it to come back, I want to use it and have it go away, I can use triticale. I can use true rye, not ryegrass. Crown vetch is a nitrogen-fixing perennial. It's not like normal vetch, so it'll stick around, and it's a good forage crop. Bird's foot trefoil is another nitrogen-fixing perennial. The seeds of those two are expensive, but if you can get some of it established, it's pretty good at holding its ground in areas that are hard for other perennials to hold their ground. Bell beans, also fava beans will work, but they're a bit bigger, but they're a good nitrogen-fixing annual. Millet gives me a grain. It attracts beneficial birds to my property. I can feed it to my animals. It produces a lot of organic matter. Fenugreek is another nitrogen fixer. And then I just put the last ones in: wildflowers and weeds. Any kind of seed that's beneficial for what you want, and even vegetables and herbs. I mean, some of the things I can tell you that you can produce even as annuals with huge amounts of seed every year: marigolds. You go buy one flat of marigolds, plant it in sunny spots around your property, and at the end of as the year goes by, every time you see a dry flower, pluck it off and take the seeds out of it. At the end of the year, you'll have gallons of marigold seeds. And if you have gallons of them and you toss them out there and only like 1% grow, you got a lot of marigolds. And you got it all for free. And then we've got a plant that repels pest insects, attracts pollinators, and looks pretty. One of my favorite herbs to do this with is basil. You plant a few basil plants one year and really intensively cultivate them, and the amount of seed that you'll get off those is just extreme. Now I want to move into zone planning and implementation. Now, the thing with planning out your zones is this is another place where people go, what if I don't want 4 zones? What if I don't want 5 zones? Well, the reality is you have them anyway because they're based on human activity. And to be fair, though, you may not have a traditional zone 4 or 5 in a suburban lot. I mean, that just makes... But in the spirit that zones come from, we all have them on our property because they're based on our level of activity. In other words, if you live in a typical suburban yard, you probably have a mailbox in your front yard. And probably at least once a day, you walk out to your mailbox and check the mail, except for Sundays. That would make it zone 1. You're going to be going there anyway, so it would make sense to put things that need daily attention in the path between where your front door is and your mailbox. If you're on a homestead and you've got a chicken coop, then it probably stands to reason you have to go out there every day and open the door and let the birds out. And go out there every night and shut them in. Now, we can automate some of that and all, but generally people check on their chickens every day. So we're going to go there every day. So we might want to cultivate a pathway out to there so that we can do things as we're already going there. Likewise, you probably have some places on your property you almost never go. And we might locate things that we don't generally need to take care of on a day-to-day basis in those areas. Things like more like a broadacre crop. So, zone 0 is actually your house. We can design our homes. That's beyond the scope of what I'm covering today, but, that's looking at the energy efficiency and things like that. Zone 1 are your areas that need continual observation. This is your kitchen garden. The things you're gonna do every day that you're gonna have to irrigate and water, finely mulched. It's where all of your intensely cultivated annuals will be. Zone 2, your less intensively managed areas. Things that can take care of themselves a little bit better. Your fruit trees in an urban environment. Moving out into some of your perennial crops in a larger property. Zone 3, occasionally visited areas that still form part of the system. They're still quite valuable. This would be on a larger property. This would be, we can have a wheat field, a corn field, an amaranth field, a grain field, a larger broadacre crop. We won't do it the same way they will in a monoculture, but this is where that type... It doesn't need to be looked after every day. We plant it, maybe we automate some irrigation to it, we get it established, and we harvest it. That's our zone 3. And that might be a little bit different in a suburban environment, what we would call a zone 3. Zone 4 is our wild food gathering or wood cutting for fuel. To me, this is where we established our food forests as well. This is farm forestry. This is where we go into major systems of trees, like I showed you in some of the pictures of the Permaculture Institute. And Zone 5 is like it's a naturally unmanaged area. And those areas tend to get progressively larger as they go outward. But one of the places where people struggle with them is they're always shown this way, this progressive bullseye. And I think it's because it's a good way to understand them, but it's not a good way to implement them. A true zoned implementation might look something more like this, where we have our zone 0, our house, and the zones take a shape, and they could morph into many different ways. All I'm saying is just start to think about, where do I go every day? What do I do when I get there? How long am I there for? Where do I almost never go on my yard or my property? Or I'm only there once a week, or I'm only there once a month. As soon as you start to do that, you start to design your system with your own natural activity in mind. So the most intensively managed areas are the areas that maybe not are always the closest to the house, but they're an area that you have to go to on a regular basis. This leads to a logical rather than haphazard implementation. I look at properties all the time where people have planted trees and they're just kind of evenly spaced and they run along a fence row. Why'd you put them there? I don't know, they lined up with the fence. Why'd you put the second one here? Well, because it lined up with the first one. Where's the wind coming from? How often do you come out here? How often does this tree need to be pruned? What do you do with it when you prune it? Where do the prunings go? And no one's even ever thought about this. So they just kind of stick it into the landscape based on structures, usually the house, a fence, a street, and then that means you're not taking nature into consideration or your own activity into consideration at all. And because of that, you are making your life harder. When we do zone design, we maximize effort by taking normal activity into consideration, and we create a flow in the daily work cycles that becomes second nature. You can see how that would work here with another picture from the Permaculture Institute. We've got a food forest built with chicken nutrient, and it's kind of out of the way. It doesn't need anybody to take care of it, but yet we've designed it so the nutrient flow from the duck pond up at the top of the hill naturally flows into the food forest. We've got a dairy lane so the cattle can be taken out to pasture or brought in. And that goes right down through the middle of the system. So we also have a place where we have another food forest on nutrient with the other side. We've got a kitchen garden, and the kitchen garden is located very close to the main house. We've got a milking shed that's right at the end of the dairy trail. So when the cow comes in to be milked, it's a natural flow. The chicken coop is right there instead of way out in the distance, so that when we go out to get our eggs in the morning or take care of our birds and let them out, they're right there. And so this is what happens as soon as you start to design with zones in mind. I want to move on now to mob grazing. I know I'm going fast. I got tons to cover with you guys today. I want to start out with another statement that I think is hard to understand, and that is that most of what we know about land management in the world today is wrong. It's dead wrong. We're literally destroying land, and I want you to look at this picture at the left and right side of that fence, and I want you to tell me if you see any discernible difference whatsoever. And then I want you to think about the main reason that we hear that the land that used to be good for grazing is no longer good for grazing is we've overgrazed it with. And then what the land needs is rest. It needs to be left alone and restored. Now, it's hard to believe, so I'm going to let pictures tell the story here, and I'm going to tell you what you've got here. On the left side of your screen, you have, this is western rangeland. This is where cattle are grazed on that land you're looking at right now. On the right side of the fence, you have a national park. That land has been untouched by livestock. It's been untouched by everything for over 70 years. It's had the National Park Service see to its maintenance and management, and it's been kept as natural as possible. But they look the same. You would expect that the right side of the screen would look much different in some way. The cattle aren't in there. We've got the best and the brightest managing it, but it looks the same. So does that mean that land like this just can't be fixed? That just, well, this is natural state for this land. No, this is not natural state for this land. To understand what happened in this country and many other parts of the world, we have to ask, how does grazing occur in nature? And you're looking at a herd of wildebeest here. You see how close they are together? Now, this is out in the Serengeti. Now, these animals could be spread out. I mean, you would think if you were managing a herd of cattle like this, you'd want them all to have kind of an area, a little bit of elbow room, moving around and freely moved, right? Well, why are they like this? I'll show you why. Because of him, right? You look at that group of, now they see the lion. They are not running away. They're kind of, like, is anybody going to get eaten right now? I'm not sure, but I don't want it to be me. They're paying attention, but they're staying together. Now, what happens to the first one of those imbecile wildebeests that strays from the herd? What happens to him? Chomp, right? He's dead. That lion is going to take him out. This is how they defend themselves. They stay in these tight groups. And by staying in these tight groups, they're able to defend themselves from predators. But what else happens? When they look like that, and that those wildebeests have been in that place for a couple hours, how much crap is on the ground? How much manure have they dropped? And they're now trampling it into the very grass that they're eating, right? But they don't want this guy to get them. They don't want to be eaten. Do you want to be eaten? Nobody wants to be eaten. So when it's time, they move as a group to a new area. That means you have a lot of animals in a very small area for a very short period of time that eat a lot, stomp a lot, cause a lot of soil disturbance, do a lot of things, and then they move on. And when they move on, they stay close together. They stay in a tight group to protect themselves from predators, and they may not be back in that location for quite a while, but when they come back again or another mob comes through, it will be done the exact same way. So, what happens when we mimic this? This is a property that was managed by Alan Savory. This picture is in October of 2004. This is at the end of the wet season. This is as good as this property ever gets. This is as good as it gets. It's just the rainy season is just, and you see the ground's even wet a little bit, but yet it's just not holding it. This is land that's been mismanaged, not taken care of for a very long time. This is land in part of Africa where you have, thousands and thousands of people starving. And Alan comes in and watch the tree that's marked with the arrow. Alan comes in, and what he does is he brings livestock in here at a rate 400 times the recommended density. Now, again, this is what it looks like. It looks like this. He brings his cattle in, and a year later, at the end of the dry season, this is as bad as it gets. It goes from this is as good as it gets to this is as bad as it gets. Let's look at another one. This one's even actually more impressive to me. This is a similar situation. So you got Alan there in the foreground, and you see where the arrow is pointing to the tree. And what he's got here is he's got a tree where almost a foot of soil is gone. You can see basically where his hand is where the soil used to be, where the soil line was, and that's how much has eroded. That's how much has been lost. Watch the tree. Just so you see it again, watch the tree. This is the exact same piece of land after it's been grazed. Now, it's been grazed in a paddock shift or mob grazing environment. The cattle don't just stay in one place. They come in, they graze. Now, what's interesting is Alan didn't put in swales. Alan didn't put in ponds. Alan didn't put in seed mixtures. Nothing has been done to this land except being grazed by cattle. That's it. And bringing back some of the herbivores along with top predators being let, instead of fencing out the zebras and the giraffes and the elephants, they're actually allowed into this area and commingling with the cattle. This is not good cropland. This is very difficult land to actually grow crops in, but it's actually very easy and very bountiful land to grow cattle in if we control them right. So what does this teach us other than we're doing it wrong? I mean, when it comes to managing our cattle, we're kind of like this dog. We haven't got it quite figured out. The dog's supposed to be telling the cow where to go, and in this case, it isn't quite happening. Well, what it tells us is that, number one, animals are necessary for a sustainable ecosystem. That we're not going to build sustainability in a completely vegetarian manner. If you go to Jeff Lawton's Permaculture Institute, you'll see that he is very, very animal intensive. Specifically in his operation, it's ducks, chickens, and cattle. And they're necessary for that system to function because I don't know if you've ever been anywhere in nature, but you almost never go to a healthy ecosystem without hearing birds and crickets and frogs and other animals. In a healthy system, there are animals. They're part of it. So when we look at a farm that's 10,000 acres of corn and there ain't an animal there, we've got a problem. I mean, that's just a very basic thing. The next thing we kind of reinforce here is that mimicking nature works. You don't get the results like I've just showed you if something doesn't work. And we also realize that we can actually change land that's been damaged. Alan said in one of the projects they did, they put these cattle in there, and people said, "What are they going to eat?" He said they'll find something, and he offered anybody that could find any grass a $5 bill, and that's quite a bit of money for those folks, and no one found a blade of grass, and they still got the same result. So we can reverse large-scale damage, and unusable land can be restored. We can do this in a lot of really harsh lands in places like Nebraska and West Texas and Wyoming. There's a lot of places in America that look just like, in fact, that national park I showed you, that was America. Okay? We've also been lied to about protein being unsustainable. All the vegans want us to believe that, we're better off eating soy and rice and stuff like that. Modern agriculture is the most unsustainable thing in the world right now. It's literally destroying the planet. There's more climate change. I mean, we can debate whether CO2 is actually the driver of climate change or not, but I can tell you that modern agriculture, even if we believe everything that the mainstream media says, modern agriculture has done more to damage the climate through desertification than the CO2 out of a tailpipe has ever even gotten close to. Next, if we mimic nature, we can also mimic large systems on a small scale, because some of you are going, well, this is great, but this looks like we're back up to hundreds or even thousands of acres of rangeland. How does this apply to me? Well, we can take mob grazing and we can scale it down to something I would call a paddock shift, or we can even do something called tractoring. So tractoring is where we have a small cage basically, and we move it every day, or we move it twice a day, and we have chickens or rabbits or something in there. Or we can do more of almost like Alan's doing, just on a smaller scale, small electronet fencing. We can even put permanent fencing into relatively small properties and simply move our animals through the system in the same way. And a lot of us are going, well, I don't have room for cattle. And honestly, especially with mini cattle on a 3-acre property, I could probably have a couple cows, 2 of them or something like that. And I really wouldn't want 1 cow. I think cattle are much happier with at least 1 other cow around them. Goats and sheep, definitely. A goat will pretty much die of loneliness if you do it alone. But I don't want the work of a cow. I don't want that much effort. It's not really what I'm looking to do. And there's nothing wrong with that. So what we can do is we can look at other animals. And what we have to realize is to mimic this behavior, all that's really necessary with using different animals, from very small to medium-sized animals, is to understand their behavior and then use it to our advantage. So for instance, a chicken. This is one of the things that most people start off with, and there's a reason. It's one of the most productive livestock animals we can keep. Even just a flock of 4 to 6 hens with no rooster will provide a family with more eggs than they probably can use. And they're very easy to take care of. They really are. They don't require a lot of work or supervision. People worry about smell and all, but when you're talking about a small flock, you're talking about not really a lot of work to keep things going. But we need to understand what they are. They're omnivores. That means they eat everything. If they ain't tied down and it tastes good in them, they'll eat it. They're scratchers. They disturb the soil. They're predators, and they're diggers. That's what they are. And if we know that, then we can say, well, how do I harness that behavior and put it into my system? Ducks are predators. They like to eat bugs, insects, slugs, and snails. They're foragers. They'll wander around a property. They're kind of soft on the landscape. In many instances, we don't even need to paddock shift them. They'll go where they're supposed to. They're very independent. But they're also borers. When the land gets wet and muddy and sticky, and there's any kind of animal down in there that they find useful to eat, a bug, a grub, a snail, something like that, they'll actually dig holes with their bills. It looks like somebody came out with a big stake and made bunches of holes in the ground. And that's good in a way. They're opening the ground. Water can get in. They've made it muddy. This will help certain things germinate if we push them off of that area after they've done this. They're breaking the pest cycle, because a lot of times what they're getting are grubs and slugs. So that's good, but we need to understand the behavior, because we may not want it in certain areas, or on some properties we may not want it at all. That doesn't mean we don't want ducks. We just have to figure out where they fit, how they fit, and where they go into the land management program. Rabbits. Most people think of rabbits as something kept in a pen, but we can tractor rabbits. We can build something that allows us to move it every day and let the rabbits out on pasture. We can even do it in a way where the rabbits at the end of the night have a place to go into. Basically, we can make a portable rabbit hutch. And now that rabbit, for all intents and purposes, is behaving like a tiny cow. In some ways, not all. It's not like a cow because it will never disturb the soil the way a cow will. It doesn't have the weight of a cow. It will never push its own manure into the ground. It will never trample a lot of the forage that's not consumed. It's very soft. That's good and it's bad because that very trampling and pushing and mashing, that's part of the recovery that we saw in some of these damaged landscapes. So we can go to something more like a goose. People think of a goose as a big duck. A goose is a very different animal from a duck. A duck likes mostly to forage for things as a predator, and it has certain vegetative matter that it eats, and it'll eat some grain if we feed it, but really it has a different dietary profile. Geese are heavy-bodied grazers. A full-size goose, something in the family of like pilgrim geese, Toulouse geese, things like that, will range 18 to 24 pounds or more. That's a significant animal. And that animal may be soft on a garden. It doesn't want to go in and eat a lot of your stuff in your garden. It's more of a grass eater and a weed eater. So we don't have to maybe hold it in paddocks as rigidly as we would something like a chicken, because a chicken can get in the garden and just tear it up. But it's going to eat grass, so it behaves like a cow. Since it's heavy-bodied, if we put it into an area and we hold it there for a couple days, it will trample its own manure into the ground a lot more than a rabbit will. So now we've got a little cow that's actually a member of the poultry family. Sheep and goats are small ruminants that in a lot of ways behave just like cattle. For the person that wants the cattle mimicry to be a little bit better than a goose, but doesn't want the trouble of a cow, sheep and goats are the way to go, with a thing that makes them better as well, though. Sheep and goats can graze on property and land that's not sufficient to graze cattle. Again, we have to move them. We have to think about their place in the landscape, but we can do that. Quail. Quail are, I would call them very, very lazy workers, but they're a good yield. But they don't do a lot of work. They're not a heavy scratcher. They're not a heavy predator or a minor predator. They're mostly a seed eater, but we can tractor quail in a system like this. Guineas or guinea hens are foragers. They're very much insectivores. They eat insects like crazy. They're very good at controlling ticks, so they have a symbiotic relationship with some of our other animals that would be susceptible to ticks and mites. They're alarm systems. They tell you when something's going on. They warn the chickens when the hawks are coming. And I've been told by quite a few people they can be mean to your chickens, so they may not need to go right in with your chickens. But my way of looking at guineas has always been that they are so self-sufficient that we don't really need to paddock them. They're not going to tear up your garden. They're not going to ruin your garden. They're not going to ruin the earth. They're not going to overgraze anything. They don't need anywhere near as much control. We can pretty much give them free rein, and they'll go wherever the pest problem is. They'll perform their watchdog duties very well, and you can let them around your geese because they ain't going to bully geese. But you might want to think about how much you let them around your chickens. And hogs. Hogs are diggers. They're compactors. They're omnivorous, and they come in many sizes. We can range hogs that barely get over 100 pounds, like Vietnamese potbelly pigs, or we can go to something that gets a little bit bigger like a American guinea hog, and we can go up from there. There's a lot of options with hogs. Now, I'm not saying that everybody should go out and get ducks, chickens, rabbits, geese, goats, quail, guineas, and hogs and put them into a system. I'm just saying that you could. And you can pick and choose from those as to what works for you, what you want, what meets your goals, and what would work on your property. In the suburbs, you're not going to have geese. Because, it's hard enough to do chickens and rabbits sometimes, but with the they're a loud, noisy animal. You need to be out in a rural area for geese, an area where they're going to be acceptable. But that doesn't mean that we should write them off. We just need to understand their behaviors. When it comes to their behaviors, what I'd like to do is go through just the chicken and talk about understanding the behaviors and the products of a chicken at a deeper level, and understand that you can do this with any animal. So let's start out with the needs of a chicken. There's one thing we need for any animal. We got to start, what do they need? They need shelter. They need grit for their crops so they can digest seeds. They need dust. They have to have a dust bath to keep themselves free of mites and other irritants. They need water. They need air. That's pretty self-explanatory. But we have to think about their coop, because the air quality is an issue there too. We want a well-designed coop that keeps them from having to breathe things that you wouldn't want to breathe. They need food. And they've got to have other chickens. Nobody has one chicken, and if you do, you don't have a very happy chicken. What do they produce? Well, they produce eggs, they produce meat, they produce feathers, they produce manure. Those are the main things that we think of. But they also produce methane, because that manure degrades, and we could harvest that methane for energy if we wanted to. They produce CO2, just like you do. Well, we could cohabitate them at least in certain times of the year in a greenhouse, because that CO2 would be beneficial for our plants. And contrary to what some environmentalists want to talk about, CO2 makes plants grow faster. They also produce heat. It's not here on the list, but if we have a small flock of birds that have access to part of a greenhouse where they can't cause trouble, but they're open air to the rest of it, they'll actually help keep it warm, believe it or not. And then we have to look at some of their behaviors. They scratch, they forage, they fly, they fight. We have to consider that. We can't have two mature roosters in all but the most extremely large situations. They're going to fight with each other over the flock. If we have enough area to separate them out into multiple flocks, we can do that, but you're not going to have two roosters living in a backyard. A lot of times you're not going to have a rooster in a backyard at all. But we do need to think about this. And then there's intrinsic characteristics. This is the breed, the color, the climate tolerance. Some birds are much better in the winter climates than others, and some do much better in warmer climates. We need to think about that. And they have breed-specific behaviors. Some breeds are a little more aggressive or a little more passive than others. Some breeds get a little bit bigger. Some breeds get a little bit smaller. All of these things need to be evaluated as we push animals through our systems. But the reality is that all of us could be doing this even on smaller properties and getting the same types of results, where instead of constantly worried about how do we till the land, how do we fertilize the land, how do we get it to grow, we can mimic these results that people like Alan Savory's getting in Africa, that Greg Judy that's doing similar work in Missouri are getting. All of this is possible with the use of small animals. Now I want to move on to seeds and developing your own regionally adapted seed strains. I've made this statement, and a lot of people have a problem with it. The best seed for your land is produced on your land. And I want to switch back to a photo that I showed you at the beginning of this, but a much bigger version of the photo. This is a cattle ranch in Llano, Texas in May from a few years ago. This land, I talked to the owner, it was never seeded. There's never been a seed brought in here. Nobody's ever planted anything. They're doing basically a mob grazing model, not quite as sophisticated as what Greg's doing, but as you can see, it has some pretty good results. Some of these plants, yes, they are perennial. The red ones are Indian blanket flower. They're a perennial flower, so they're going to come back every year, but they don't generally spread very fast through mounding. They spread with seed. You've got another type of coneflower. I can't remember the name of the coneflower, but the yellow flowers there are not black-eyed Susans. They're a type of coneflower. But you've got tons of other colors and different varieties of flowers growing in here. Now, this property has been around since the beginning and the dawn of time. It's probably had cattle on it for as long as white people have existed in Texas, right? So that's going back hundreds of years. But it's been managed this way for about 30 years. So the seeds that you're seeing today have not just been here for millennia, but for the last 3 decades. They've been growing in the exact same type of environment at the exact same location, and look at the results. And I would ask anyone, would you like that to be your backyard? Would you love a garden that looks like that? Have you ever struggled to plant wildflowers and get this result? Those flowers and all of the plant species with them, and all of the weeds that we would normally try to get rid of, are so adapted that they're in the Texas hill country, some of the harshest stuff on, in the whole country. It's a harsh environment. They only get about 20 inches of rain down there a year. Look at it. That's because those plants are so adapted, and we can do the same thing with saving our own seed on our own land. And seed saving is actually easy. And I can't go into all of the things you do to save seed or the ways that you do it. I'm going to give you 2 great resources for that. Seed Savers Exchange, located at seedsavers.org, and the International Seed Saving Institute, which is probably actually the better one for how to and what to do. It's at seedsave.org. The bigger thing is, when you're saving seeds, you have an opportunity to accelerate nature. Now, if you just took all the seed produced every year and put it on the ground and let what grows, nature will do it for you. But we can speed this up, and we can get the traits we want. So one thing we can do is we can look at the size of the product. If we want a large tomato, we can save the seeds from the biggest tomatoes. If we do that for a couple of years, we start to produce more and more consistently large tomatoes. Time of production. What if you wanted to beat an insect pest at its own game? So one of the biggest problems for people that want to grow corn is the corn borer worm. You open up this big cob of corn, and it's got this worm, and he's eating half of your corn, and you break the end off the ear, and you lose a lot that way to these guys. And sometimes they can devastate a crop. So what does Monsanto do? We'll put insecticide in the corn. It'll kill the worm. But don't worry, eat the corn. It'll be fine. No worries at all. Just eat that corn. It's good for you. Nah, I don't think so. But one of the things we can do is we can look at the time that the insect emerges. And it actually emerged rather late in the year. So we can plant an early corn for our area, get it in the ground as early as possible, and try to beat that insect at its own game to get there first. Well, what if when we did that, we went out there and planted that corn, we went out with a notebook, and we marked the first 10 plants that emerged. Okay, and then we followed that up by comparing those 10 with the first plants to put on tassels, maybe 20 in a bigger field, 20 plants. First 20 to emerge from the soil, first 20 to put on tassels so that they're ready to start pollinating, and the first 20 to produce a harvestable cob. And those cobs we actually left. We didn't take them. We left them that year. We left them go till they dried out so they were a seed crop for the next year. And we planted the seed from the earliest emerging corn. What would happen if we did that for 4 or 5 seasons? Well, we'd take a corn that's already known to emerge early, and we'd accelerate that trait. And we'd come up with a corn variety for our region that was the earliest we could create. We can do that. We can do survival of harsh conditions. That's what I said in the beginning. You could just throw it out there. Treat it mean. Don't do anything for it. Leave it into the most awful conditions. 10% of it survives. Don't harvest any of that for your use. Save that. Plant it again next year. Do it again. Do it again. Do it until you get a harvestable yield. And then maybe give it a little bit more tender loving care, a little bit more help. But that's one way we can do it. We can do, or we can do, hey, plant the stuff. You know you're going to get one more frost. Plant it. See if anything makes it. Save the seed from the stuff that makes it. Don't plant it all. Say, when you're doing these things in the harsh conditions, hold some back to be put into more cultivated areas for your own yield. But we can do these test beds. We can do color, flavor characteristics, days until germination, anything we want. And it's more important that we think about it that way than we just think, well, I'm going to do the biggest or the best tasting. Those are good traits too. But hardiness, rigor, vigor, early germination, maybe even in some instances you want something that takes longer to germinate. There are reasons you might want to do that, because you might want to put it into a seed mixture where it comes up at the same time as something else that normally takes longer to germinate. It's all up to us. Again, we're the artists, and this is our canvas, right? I want to talk about some seed-saving myths, though, because this is something that whenever I hear somebody selling survival seed banks or, these seeds have not been modified in any way, that stuff, there's a lot of myths out there. The first one is that hybrids are GMOs, or genetically modified organisms. They are not. Yes, I am yelling at you. I promise it's the only time I'll do it during this presentation. But GMOs are not hybrids. They're just not. And hybrids are not GMOs. Okay? A hybrid, let's start with a GMO. A GMO is genetically modified with an unnatural method. We either take a gene gun and we literally shoot genes into the DNA strands and cause mutations, or we take a gene and we put it into a virus and we let a virus infect the other organism, and we take something like a gene from a fish and put it into a cotton plant. I said, cotton's not that bad. I put it on my shirt. Yeah, well, how many things have cottonseed oil in them? That's a GMO. Hybrids are a natural crossing of a species. It's just a crossing. It happens in nature all the time. Like a shepherd and collie dog. You cross a shepherd and collie dog. We don't need a gene gun to do that. You put a female collie with a male shepherd, and they're both at the right time in their lives, and you'll get puppies, right? It's a natural process. And understand that most heirlooms began as hybrids. Very few things we plant today began the way that they are. The hybridization, selection, seed saving is what led to them. Maybe certain varieties of amaranth are the way they always were. Maybe things like orich or goosefoots or things like that. Things that are more like wild foods that we cultivate from time to time. But every tomato that you've ever eaten in your life started out as a hybrid, because the original tomato was very small, grew in the desert, and was only yellow. Okay? So we had to get here from there. So the way that happens is a hybrid, they say, won't produce true to type. This is true and false. What will happen is if you cross two, you'll get the first generation that comes out of that. You'll get a fruit that looks the same, or a vegetable that looks the same. The seed you take from there, when you plant it, will produce the first generation, the F1 hybrid, and it will have characteristics of both plants in its lineage. And a lot of times it will be an improvement. It'll have more vigor. It'll grow faster. It'll be grow faster. It'll be larger. In some way, it will seem to have an improvement. This is why we did it. We didn't do it to mess things up. We did it because we got a positive result. Okay. Now the problem is when we take prodigy from those generations into the F2 generation, the second time those plants, now they're not crossing, it's two of these hybrids interpollinating, and we save that seed, a lot of it will come out with weird traits. We might get 1 in 10 plants that produce the same result we got in the F1 generation. But if we save the seed from just those 10 plants and do it next season, we'll get more plants that got the original result. And if we do it again, and generally it takes 5 to 7 generations to prove out the new characteristics of what will become a new heirloom seed. This can't be done with all plants, but most plants it can be done with. So even the hybrid can become an heirloom. That's how the process works. The next myth is cross-pollination is a major concern. Oh my God, corn, you got to have it 2 miles away from any other corn. Well, there'd be no corn seed in the world then. Okay? And there's some things we can do. So crops like corn and sorghum that are wind pollinators, if you separate them 100 yards, you're going to get a cross-pollination factor of about 2%. And it's just not enough to matter, and it might actually be beneficial as you develop your own regional strain over time. In Mexico, the farmers actually plant their cornfields next to natural stands of a plant called Seoente, spelled with a T. And they do that because it's a wild corn. It's actually believed to be the progenitor of corn, the original corn. Not very useful today. But the Mexican farmers believe it helps strengthen their crops. So a little bit of it actually might be good. But we can do time again. Time's so simple. I have 2 corns, A and B. I plant A. 2 weeks later, I plant B. When A is going to pollen, B's not ready yet. When B's going to pollen, A's already done. It's very simple. And then there are things like squash and cucumbers and melons that tend to not only cross, but the seed saved from them will often produce something you really don't want even in the first generation. Well, this is simple. You hand pollinate. So on all of these plants, you'll have a female blossom. There'll be a fruit behind the blossom, and you just watch it. And when the flower's about to open, you open it by hand, you take a male flower, you put them together and you pollinate it, take a little bit of masking tape, tape the flower shut so no insects can get into the female flower, and a day or two later the flower will fall off. Put a little zip tie or something around the stem of the female plant and save. And when you harvest it, mark it in some way, and that's a plant to harvest seed from, and it's a true match. So there's easy things that we can do with that. The next thing is seeds must be stored in some special way. And I'm going to probably hack some people off about this that sell survival seed banks and all, but the reality is it's overblown. Seed, here's the rules. Keep it cool, keep it dry, and keep it out of harsh light, and it'll probably be fine. And the next thing to remember that seed saves itself in the harsh reality of nature. Every year, plants go to seed, and they come back next year. They sit out in the winter all year long. My grandfather used to save 2 things he saved every year. Peppers and tomatoes. And God, I was a dumb kid, and I never thought about it when I went off to the Army and those seed lines went away. But he would save those seeds every year from whatever he thought was the best looking tomatoes and peppers of that year. And he would open those and get the seeds out, and there's a process for tomato with setting them in water and all, and he did that. And the pepper seeds basically you just take out and let them dry, and he put them in an envelope, and he wrote the year on it. He stuck them in an old cigar box, and he put them up in a cabinet in a shanty, which is like a shed in rural Pennsylvania, in a workshop with no heating, no air conditioning, no nothing, and just stuck them in there. And then so he would do that around August, as you're getting ready to turn into the fall in Pennsylvania. And then around the end of January, he'd go out there and he'd start his seeds, and he'd put them in a cold frame, and he, put them on in the radiator first to germinate them and pick them out and put them in his pots. And he would do that every year. And a lot of times, he had seed left over from previous years, and he would use seed that was 1.5 years old at that point, that had been kept that way, because what he said was, if I have a failure, I have fresher seed to replace it with. 2 is 1, 1 is none. Okay? And that seed that was 1.5 years old always germinated very well. You'd probably get, 9 out of 10 seeds would germinate, which is as good as we get in most packages. So I'm not saying that it doesn't make sense to put a little bit more care into your seed saving than that. I'm just saying don't let it convince you that it's that's completely necessary. I want to talk about why we need to save seeds right now, though. Number one, it's the only way we can be self-sufficient and sustainable. People that sell you the seed banks are absolutely right about that. If you can't save your own seed, you're always dependent on somebody for more seed. Next, locally adapted seed gets stronger every year. If you're saving your own seed every year, the traits and characteristics of your plants are naturally going to strengthen and become tougher over time. Within a few seasons, there's no hybrid that can touch it. It just can't. Even though hybrids do have their place and have some places where they make sense. Locally grown seeds over time develop unique characteristics, or a terroir, they call it in the wine industry. This is where, like, well, Mrs. Smith's apples are so awesome, or Mr. Williams has these incredible tomatoes, or Tom over there has these incredible peppers. That's how that happens. That's why two people are growing the same variety of peppers, say California Wonder, across the street from each other, and they even have good results, but one's just, man, they're just something about them. That's what it is. That person has a plant that's developed its own characteristics. And as humans, when we taste something that has its own characteristics, we know it's something special. And as locally living people, we're best suited to eat the things that come from our local area. Our bodies are adapting at the same time. And by feeding ourselves with local food, we actually build our health the same way the plants do. That doesn't mean we can't have chocolate from South America. It just means that it makes sense for a part of our diet to come from right where we live. Seeds have value, and locally adapted seeds are a store of wealth. I'm telling you that there is a value, an extreme value there. And I would imagine that most of you would pay more for a packet of seeds from a neighbor who's been doing what I'm talking about for 10 years than you would for any packet of tomato seeds from any seed manufacturer out there. There's a store of wealth there. Large quantity of seeds are expensive, especially when you get into mixes. And we don't have to just be saving tomatoes and peppers, folks. We don't even have to be saving the seed. If we're progenerating the plants and letting them self-seed, they can drop tons of seed literally on our pastures, right? The next is the GMO threat is real. The goal of the mega corporations, Monsanto, Conagra, Bayer, these companies, they want total control of the food supply. And they're destroying the diversity. And that's the big reason, restoring genetic diversity. I'm going to show you a graphic right now. Some of you will have seen something like this before, and you'll think you know where I'm going. I'm probably not. I'm thinking about $1 in 1900, and I want you to think about the value of that dollar in 2013. It's about 3 cents. You might think, has he switched to a lecture on the Federal Reserve? No. I want you to see that dollar in 1900 is all the different types of heirloom variety seeds that were available. And today, that dollar would be represented by 3 pennies. We've lost 97%, not just of the value of our money in about 100 years, but 97% of the diversity of our seeds. And that makes that threat on GMOs and megacorporations much bigger. Now, the reality is that number, that 97% loss, is based on a study done in 1990. And we're probably close to a nickel or maybe a nickel and a penny today, but we ain't up to a dime yet. We have an opportunity to not restore that diversity, but replace it. Many of those seed lines, like my grandfather's, are gone forever. They're never coming back. But somebody developed them in the first place, and we can develop new ones. And I'd like to see us actually improve over where we were in 1900. We're on the right track, but if we don't have enough people doing it, it's never going to happen. The last thing I want to talk about today is my own design, and it's based on contour-based gardening, which is similar to Swales that we talked about in the beginning. That's why we talked about it in the beginning. And it's based on a process called hugelkultur, which is brilliantly simple and made famous by Sepp Holzer. It's pretty simple. You take wood, you bury it. There's more to it than that. Seed mixtures, polyculture, all different types of things go into this. But the big advantages have been seen: incredibly vigorous growth of the plants and little to no need for irrigation. Sometimes you need some, but a lot less. And this is the way that one person did. These photos are from, and the graphics are from Paul Wheaton at richsoil.com. And basically you can see here's a project somebody did in a divided highway. Piled up a bunch of wood, piled a bunch of organic matter and dirt on top of it, planted into it, and the wood core begins to break down and become spongy, and it helps supply a reserve of water, and everything grows much better. But remember, this isn't something Sepp Holzer created. In fact, I can tell you for a fact, Sepp, when he first started making these raised beds, these hugel beds, back in the 70s, is what I saw his DVDs come from about this. He said at that time the reason he buried the wood is because he had all these spruce trees that needed to come down because they weren't doing anything beneficial for the land, and he needed to do something with them, so he was going to build these raised beds, so he stuck them in there. And it's kind of a byproduct. Well, nature builds hugel beds. Nature builds wood core beds. I'm calling them wood core beds now because when I tell somebody in America about a hugel bed, they look at me like I have Godzilla coming out of my left ear. They have no idea what I'm talking about. If I say a wood core bed, they at least are on the right path. But if you look at this tree that fell over in the forest, it's already rotting. Organic matter's beginning to accumulate on it. And eventually a forest will grow, a fallen forest for us. But I had a problem with these things from the beginning, where you call them wood core or hugel beds, but how and why they work. Now, I'm not a person that gets in the way of success for myself. So when I see people doing something and it works, I just start doing it right away. And I've been building hugel beds, wood core beds, various sizes, shapes, and formats now for about 3.5 years. I've been to Montana where Sepp did a major project up there, about a 5-acre stand of hugel beds. These things were 2 meters high, 70-degree angle, beautiful stuff, just like he's done in Austria. Amazing amount of polyculture that went into them. And that's part of why I don't call what we're doing in America primarily hugel beds, because that's a hugel bed, a high bed. And we're doing most lower beds in the ground systems and things like that. But the original explanation, and this got wild, crazy hot thanks to Paul Wheaton in America about 3 or 4 years ago. The original explanation was the wadding wood core becomes a spongy reservoir of water. And if you think about that, it seems to make sense. You go find a rotted log in the woods with a bunch of leaves over top of it. Even when it's very dry, you pull the leaves off and you squeeze it, it's wet. But it doesn't pass a critical thinking test. So I started doing it right away. But I was always asking, how does it really work? Here's why it doesn't work that way. If I had a 12-foot long bed and a huge wood core in it, 4 feet wide by 4 foot high, a cubical core, the total volume of water that could exist in that space would be about 1,400 gallons. That's using a pond volume calculator. So if that 4 by 4 by 12 wood core wasn't wood, but a tank, a metal tank, and I filled it up, it would hold about 1,400 gallons. But look, we know the wood can't hold 100% of its volume in water, or there'd be no wood left. There wouldn't be any wood there, right? So there has to be some wood to hold the moisture. So if that wood core would hold, and this would be a lot, 20% of its volume, we're talking about 280 gallons of water on a 12-foot bed that's a little over 4 feet wide, and that's not enough to explain how well the wood core beds work. If we irrigated with that same amount of water over a 2 or 3 month dry period, as some of these beds have survived, or longer with no irrigation or very little irrigation, these beds have survived, 280 gallons probably wouldn't get the job done. And that would be putting the water where it's the most accessible to the plants. And that would be if 100% of the water came out of the wood and got used. It doesn't work. The math fails. So what gives? How do these things work? As I started working with these, I've come to a series of answers. Number one, wood core gardening is carbon farming, and that creates resiliency. So whenever we talk to anybody about sustainable agriculture, any good sustainable person will tell you that we're all carbon farmers. We need to be putting carbon into the soil. Well, when we put 4 feet wide by 4 foot high by 12 foot long wood core into a ground or into a mound, we're putting literally tons of carbon into the ground. So the fact that carbon's going in there alone is going to improve our results. Wood cores promote the fungal activity and speed up the formation of fungal hyphae. Now, I talked about fungus being the teeth of the forest. What I didn't tell you then is this. In a good cubic yard of forest soil, there will be about 350 miles of fungal hyphae. And that fungal hyphae will literally attach itself to the root systems of the other plants growing in that soil and do an exchange. It'll say, plant, if you give me certain nutrients, I'll give you moisture. So that fungal growth in that wood core is part of it. Wood cores are not reservoirs. That's the other thing I figured out. They're not reservoirs, they're wicks. And they have access to subsurface water. So if you think about this, if I took a shallow pan full of water and I stick a sponge in it and I wait, what happens? Sponge gets wet. Now I take another sponge and I set it on top of the first sponge, it'll get wet too. Maybe not as wet, but pretty wet. If I take a third sponge and put it on the top, it'll also get wet, a little less, but it'll keep taking water up and stay quite damp. Put a fourth one, same thing happens. It goes down over time. The higher I go, the less water can actually get into there. But as long as there's water in the pan, all of the sponges will stay at least damp. Now, if I plant a seed into the top sponge, as long as I keep the reservoir on the bottom full, it can access that water through the sponging, the wicking motion. This is what hugelkultur really does. This is what wood cores do. If you dig a hole anywhere in the ground, even when it's very dry, you go down deep enough, the soil gets moist in all but the most extreme conditions. There's that flow of water we talked about, the forest floor being a lake. The earth is a lake. There's moisture everywhere. That wood core gives access to that moisture that's down there. It's like turning the earth into a giant self-watering container. Wood cores are also nutrient and nitrogen traps. People worry about this. Well, the nutrient, the nitrogen, it's going to eat it all up. No, it's going to go in there and start breaking it down, and it's going to hold it and slow release it like a time release capsule over time. So we might want to provide a little bit of supplemental nitrogen, but I can tell you when Sep builds one of these things, he doesn't do nothing. He lets the seed mixture and the legumes take care of that for him, but I can see doing it. In fact, I do a little bit of it myself. Wood cores provide food for the soil organisms. We want all that biological life that's in that forest floor that's a lake. See how this all ties together, right? So it provides that food for the soil organisms. Wood cores mimic natural forest formation. Because I just showed you that tree falls and the forest grows on a fallen forest. And wood cores will help hold the structure of landscape and reduce erosion. So now we can build our raised beds without putting any kind of border around them. We just pile the earth up, and they stay for us a little bit better until the plants establish and hold them together with their root systems. I should have known this was the case from the beginning, that I wouldn't find an answer, that I would find multiple answers. And again, I brought in a picture, and you're like, what the heck does this got to do with anything? It's a fish. It's a bass. I'd say, looking at the color, it's a smallmouth bass. But what I want to ask you right now is that fisherman's bringing that fish in. What happens if that line breaks? That line breaks, there's no more fish. It doesn't matter if the line breaks right where the lure is, at the tip of the rod, down by the reel, or somewhere in between. Anywhere that line breaks, we get the same result. No fish, and the only way to get another fish is to put on a new lure and start fishing. Saying the wood core just holds water is a line. Permaculture doesn't work in a line, it works in a net. And any technique that holds its ground is a net. And I've just given you a net. Carbon farming, fungal activity, wicking water, nutrient and nitrogen trap, food for soil organisms, mimicking forest formation, and holding structure. Now it's a symbiotic system. Now it's a net. Now look at the net. I could cut 20 or 30 strands of that net, and I might lose some fish, but I'm going to still catch some of them. It will still work. It's much easier to repair. And it's not a catastrophic failure. This is how these systems work, and it's what led to me putting in my systems my way. Now, I've always been impressed with Jeff Lawton. He's probably my favorite permaculture mentor. Really recommend you check out jefflawton.com if you haven't already. And here he is using the same type of equipment. I have a different model, but the same type of equipment I use to find the contours in my landscape, which I'll show you in just a second. A laser level. And they're pretty expensive. The system I have is about $700. I bought it because I figure I'll do some consulting, and I figure if I'm going to charge for consulting, then, and I'm not going to do a lot, but if I'm going to charge it all for it, and I have to be able to put it out, having a professional piece of equipment would be a great way to justify the charge. So I use this type of equipment to find where those level lines are that I showed you in a previous graphic. But we don't really need to use something this sophisticated. We can use something called a A-frame level. And if you look on the left, you'll see some students of Bill Wilson from Midwest Permaculture using a pretty snazzy looking A-frame level. It's got, angles cut into it. It's perfectly symmetrical. It's got braces. You can't see it, but they have a string hanging from it with a plumb bob, a professional tool for creating a line center. And then you'll see over to the right-hand side a little less sophisticated tool. It's made with an old padlock, a piece of string, 2 pieces of rebar, and a piece of scrap wood all wired together. Guess what? They both work just fine. The way you get one of these tools to work is you find a known level surface. You build your A-frame, try to make it symmetrical, but it doesn't have to be perfect. And then put the A-frame level on a known level surface. How do you do this? Get a long board, shim it, put a carpenter's level on it so you get the bubble in the carpenter's level, dead level. Now put the A-frame level on it. Wherever that string hangs with that weight, mark a line like you see on the right-hand side of your screen there. There's your level. And you can mark out level with flags or stakes or what have you, and it is that simple. So I wanted you to realize there's sophisticated tools to do this with, and then there's very simple low-tech technology like the A-frame levels, but they used A-frame levels to build the pyramids. So it's a little more sophisticated than we give it credit for. This is an overhead view of my property, and this is kind of cool. And some of the stuff you see there isn't there anymore. Most of it is. And these contours are not perfect. I shot contours all over my property using a laser level, and it's very close, but in some places it deviates, and it's from erosion. So the shape of the land has actually changed from erosion. That's some of what I'm trying to reverse right now. But you see my property's in kind of a saddle. And up in the center, back, up top, right under the word building, you'll see a big green blob. That's a set of gardens that were put in a conventional raised bed using railroad ties, which I think are icky because they deposit all kinds of things like creosote into my soil. And then you'll see some lines just to the east of them, just to the right side of your screen of them, that come out and then they bend and they go over toward that other pasture. Basically what I'm doing is relocating the garden up onto those lines. So if you look at the line that comes off of the corner, and you go up to the next one, so the third one from there comes out almost straight and starts to bend. I'd say down south of there, that second one that comes through that if you look, you'll see a green square, okay? And that green square is actually the septic drain field. That's why it's green. That's kind of interesting. Well, if you look at the line that goes through the bottom left corner of it, just a little bit inside of the green, that's probably where my first bed is. So that bed comes out and kind of bends this way, and then the next row is a little bit further back and does the same. And basically, all of the this garden will be moved into this oblique-shaped series of beds in here. And that's what I'm going to show you how I built it. But the important thing to understand is they're on contour, so they harvest water. So here's one of the beds under construction. There's a couple of beds in the background that have already been constructed, as you can see. And what I did was excavate about a foot deep. I would have gone deeper, but the rock is such here that that's about as far as I could go by hand. I'll be putting in a lot more of these using an excavator, which is the smart way to do it. But this is a proof of concept. And before I bring in an excavator and students for a workshop, I wanted to prove the concept out. It's proving out quite well. So we went in and we put, this is mostly live oak from trees that are dying of a fungus that exists out here, which is fine because it doesn't affect anything but these oaks. So we cut down the dead trees and we put them into the trench. Pretty simple from here. Next step, I went ahead and I wanted to show you guys how light a level I'm talking about. So I took this picture. This is a little bit of compost. This gives a little bit of nutrient to kickstart the logs being, a little bit of nitrogen to start that process, but it's just a light coating of compost that I added as my first layer. Then Max came around as I began restoring it. Now you'll see stakes. The stakes on the left and the right, what I did is first I put in a line of stakes that were where the contour line is. And then I dug a 2.5 foot wide trench with those stakes representing the middle. Once that was done, obviously the stakes had to be removed as I dug the trench. Into that ditch went the wood that you've just seen. And then this is all of the soil that was excavated has been returned. Once that was done, I knew I wanted these beds to be 4'6" because that's about the widest bed that I can reach the center of from either side. And you might want to build just a little smaller or bigger depending on how long your arms are and how much you want to reach and bend. So that's how that was done. So what I did was take a tape measure. You see Max sitting on it. And 27 inches is the center of 4'6". So I put the 27-inch mark at the center of the pile. And then at 4'6" on one side, I put a stake in the ground. And where the tape reached the other side, I put a stake in the ground. That's the outline of the bed that I'm creating. So then I brought in a layer of compost. I didn't till it into the soil. I just laid it down. I'm going to let all the little soil organisms take care of that. Max was tired, so he took a break. So then I continued to bring in, and I'm using fill from the existing gardens to make up the difference because I can only excavate so much in this soil that has a layer of limestone just about a foot underneath it. So now I'm starting to use the fill from the garden, and I'm lucky. It's nice fill I was sitting there able to use. Once I got it out to the stakes, I got my 4'6" dimension, another layer of compost. From there, and the bed on the left is the one you just saw me building, and the one on the right that's not mulched yet is a new bed that's still under construction even as I record this. In fact, it looks just like that right now if I look out my window. In between the two beds, you'll see what I've done. I've gone in there on contour, and I've created a very shallow, flat swale. So I went in there with a hoe, a really cool tool called a rogue hoe. It's a pretty awesome tool. And I went in there, I took about 2 inches of soil, and if you look in the foreground, you can kind of see about how much is excavated. This was a hard shot to get, but if you look at the edge of the bed, You can kind of see it's a significant amount. It's about 2 inches of soil that was removed, 2 inches of depth removed in between the bed rows. And that's done in the front of them, the back of them, in between them. And that's eventually mulched. That now forms a catchment. Water comes down and hits the first bed, gets absorbed into it, settles down into the ground, the overflow moves around, and these are set up with offset gaps. All right, so this is the best photo I could get for you right now, but if you look at here what I'm talking about, you can see where the stakes are. The 2 stakes in so you see 3 stakes in each row. The first 2 stakes are the 4'6" dimension, and then the stakes in the foreground, the closest ones to you, are how far out I'm removing the soil and piling it up onto here before I bring fill in to get my 2 inches of depth. But if you look at the bed in the second row back on the right with the green, the bright green flowers, those are Jerusalem artichokes, and the new bed that you just saw the construction of, in between them is a gap. That gap is about 3 feet. It's dead level, and it just pitches back just with the land, exactly with the land contour to the next bed. That allows the moisture to go to the next row, and then to the next row, and then to the next row, as this system is continuously built out over time. The next bed that will go in the system will be, if you look behind the bed you just saw being constructed, that's not planted with anything yet, there's a patch of green grass right there. All that will come out, and a short bed will go in there as that next garden bed gets ripped out. And from that point forward, we'll probably be using equipment, and I'll stop digging and killing myself digging in this very harsh, rocky soil. This stuff's bad. If you look all the way in the back right side, you'll see a pile of cinder blocks and timbers just to the right of my truck. A little bit over from there, you'll see a pile of rock. That is the rock pile that's come out of these beds that have been dug by hand. It's pretty tough stuff. But if it'll work here, it'll work anywhere. And now I want to maybe show you some pictures and tie this all together at the end and see this with new eyes. I showed you an overhead at the beginning of this tutorial. And when I did, this was part of what you saw. And now you're seeing it from a different angle. This is the gardens at the Permaculture Institute in Australia. And I think if you would have looked at this before, you would have said, oh, it's kind of a neat pattern, it's kind of cool, it bends a little bit, but now you know why it bends. These are also done on contour. These aren't wood core beds like what I've just shown you. But what they allow now is for that contour water harvesting the exact same way. All the wood core does is kind of accelerate it, speed it up, and make it a little bit more powerful. The pathways between, if you look at my system, they're a lot more narrow. And that's because they had a different goal or agenda in mind. I'm planting a lot of perennials into my system as well. It'll almost be a forest garden when I'm done with it on some levels. And I want to be able to fit a wheelbarrow down the pathways. So this was more of an intensively managed situation. But now look straight ahead to the end. Okay, if you look to the end, what you actually see is a forest. All those stakes coming up out of the ground in the distance, those are stakes for trees. That's that food forest being extended. And you can see the systems start to work together. And I want to make sure you understand this can be done in much smaller systems. Now look at this picture. I'm sure if you'd looked at this picture in the beginning, if you knew who Jeff was, you'd be like, oh, that's Jeff or whatever. But, he's just sitting there on a little bridge. Well, this is a backyard. This is a very small property. I mean, this is like postage stamp, 1/10 of an acre property. What is that ditch, though? That ditch is a swale. What's behind Jeff? Behind Jeff is a pond. Look at the water on the top of the pond. You see how green it is? It's got nutrient in it. What happens when there's a rainfall event and water, if you look along the back right-hand side, you'll see there's another top-level swale that feeds the pond. So it's like a path, but when it's a lot of rain, it actually dumps water into that pond. What happens when there's too much water for that pond to hold it all? Well, it comes over those rocks like a sill, a spillway, and it goes right into where Jeff's feet are. And it goes through that swale. What do you think that swale's doing? Well, look at what's planted on the downhill side of the swale, different plants and shrubs. There's a citrus there in the foreground. So what happens to all that nutrient? It goes into that swale. That nutrient then feeds those plants. It's all passive. It all works together. Now it's on a small scale. Next one. This is something that is an incredible design that Jeff came up with for a property. And the reason I'm showing you this now is it'll really take you through everything that we've gone through today. Okay? All the blue are little dams that are put in. and they're all connected by swales. It's ridge to ridge, connected by swales. The dams fill, they backfill the swales, and then there's forest planted all along the swales. So when we think of forest, we think of these big multi-acre things, hundreds of acres, tens of acres at least. But you can see the forest here is in strips. But the strips create natural paddocks. That's what all of the shapes that you see are. So that we can now take livestock of any variety and push them through this system. We have a home down at the bottom, a large feature dam behind it. We've got water held everywhere in the system. And we've got a self-regenerating, self-replicating system with some big paddocks. They could even be taken into smaller paddocks if we wanted to. But the shape just forms. And if I'd shown you this 2 hours ago, you probably went, oh, that's nice. But if you really think about everything that I've covered today, food forestry, if you think about saving seeds, paddock shift, conversion of lawn to pasture, and contour-based gardening, wood core beds, you should see this in a totally different light. You should see this and go, I can build that anywhere. That's what permaculture is really about, being able to build these systems everywhere. Now, this is just an overview. This is an opening to what's possible. This is an exposure to techniques. You're going to want a lot more. So I'm going to tell you that I have made it easy for you, because everybody always wants the PowerPoint deck. I have put a huge list of resources online at thesurvivalpodcast.com/permaculture. On that page, you can also get this entire PowerPoint deck, the latest version of it, wherever we're at with it for free. And I appreciate you for tuning in to today's presentation.